From the enigmatic smile of the Mona Lisa to groundbreaking inventions that foreshadowed modern technology, Leonardo da Vinci's insatiable curiosity and relentless quest for knowledge established his reputation as a genius and one of history's most influential figures. Lately I've been obsessed with the life and work of Leonardo da Vinci. I've read his biography by Walter Isaacson, followed by another book titled How to Think Like Leonardo da Vinci by Michael Gelb, which is of course something that I and many other people aspire to do, including Boxman. You know, he often describes himself as a bit of a polymath. He's very inspired by the idea of the Renaissance man and strives to excel in a wide range of fields.
Oh, come on. He can hope to be skilled in as many areas as he likes, but he's clearly not a genius. How hubris to assume he can ascend to such a level.
Although Leonardo da Vinci is often considered to be a genius, it doesn't mean that anyone else's efforts to be more like him is futile. And I'm not saying that Boxman can learn to be a genius, I'm saying that anyone who wishes to realise their full potential can do so.
The essential elements of Leonardo da Vinci's approach to learning and the cultivation of intelligence are quite clear and can be studied, emulated, and applied.
It's about looking towards those who have come before us as guiding examples for us to improve our own lives, and Leonardo da Vinci undoubtedly sets an example, and that is why I wanted to make a video like this to discuss his approach to living life with the intention to learn from him. I'm also going to do some drawing throughout this video, and what I am drawing is the cathedral in Florence. Filippo Brunelleschi was the man who designed that dome, and if you think you've heard his name before, then you're probably right, because as I mentioned in my first Simple Perspective video, he's often credited with the development of linear perspective. So he was another very influential figure whose work certainly inspired Leonardo da Vinci, but their lives didn't overlap. Brunelleschi died in 1446, whilst Leonardo da Vinci was born in 1452. And he was born in a much quieter Tuscan hill town called Vinci. Hence his name, Da Vinci, meaning from Vinci. Leonardo was born out of wedlock. His father, Ser Piero da Vinci, was not married to his mother. Whilst these days that doesn't really impact your life at all, back then it did carry a bit of social stigma, like he didn't inherit the same privileges or wealth that a legitimate son would have. It also limited his access to university to receive a formal education, but whilst all of this sounds quite negative, it actually worked in his favour because his father, who still supported him, was a notary, essentially an accountant, as was his grandfather. And if Leonardo would have been legitimate, he would have also followed in their footsteps, but instead he was disqualified from the Guild of Notaries, and as a result was free to pursue his own more creative interests. So really he dodged a bullet there. He did receive some basic training in maths at what was referred to as an abacus school, but for the most part he was self-taught. And in the biography by Walter Isaacson, the book that I'll be referencing many times throughout this video, there is a section with the heading Disciple of Experience, in which he explains how Leonardo, whilst sometimes defensive, actually took some pride in his lack of formal schooling, which led him to be just that, a disciple of experience and experiment.
I am fully aware that my not being a man of letters may cause a certain presumptuous people to think that they may, with reason, blame me, alleging that I am a man without learning. Foolish folk, they strut about puffed up and pompous, decked out and adorned, not with their own labors, but by those of others. They say that, because I have no book learning, I cannot properly express what I desire to describe, but they do not know that my subjects require experience rather than the words of others.
That was an extract from one of Leonardo's notebooks. You know, despite his lack of formal education and the presumptions of others, you know, he never limited himself. He always maintained a can-do attitude and was confident in his own capabilities.
His method was rooted in experiment, curiosity, and the ability to marvel at phenomena that the rest of us rarely pause to ponder after we've outgrown our wonder years.
Curiosity, or curiosita, is the first of 7 Da Vincian principles that Michael Gelb discusses in his book. He says it is the quest for continuous learning, something that I'm a very big advocate of, and also something that I try to exemplify on this channel. Although Boxman never talks, and as a result is unable to verbalise the questions he wants to ask, I can see that he's often engaged in deep thought. I just hope he's thinking about the right things.
Great minds ask great questions.
That's right, Boxgirl, and Leonardo da Vinci was constantly doing that.
Okay, we get it. It's good to be curious, but curiosity doesn't pay the bills. Surely he didn't spend all his days roaming around the countryside, drawing trees and rivers?
Well, he did spend a lot of his early years in Vinci doing just that, but eventually, like for all of us, we get to an older age and start thinking about what we want to do with our lives. Until he was 12, Leonardo had lived in Vinci until his father brought him to live in Florence, which, well, let's just say that around that time, Florence was the perfect environment for a creative individual with a curious mind. And as you might have guessed, this is where the term Renaissance man originated from. Because during this Renaissance period, there was a lot of emphasis on the value of learning and pursuing many different things. If you were skilled and had a good understanding in various disciplines such as art, science, literature, and philosophy, it was celebrated. It was a product of humanism, a movement which focused on human potential and achievement. And there were many individuals around Florence who engaged in multiple disciplines.
The mixing of ideas became the norm as people of diverse talents intermingled. Silk makers worked with gold beaters to create enchanted fashions. Architects and artists developed the science of perspective. Woodcarvers worked with architects to adorn the city's 108 churches. Shops became studios. Merchants became financiers. Artisans became artists.
Because Leonardo's father, Piero, was a notary, he had a lot of connections, and when Leonardo was around 14 years old, his father secured him an apprenticeship with one of his clients who was an artist and engineer called Andrea del Verrocchio. He had his own workshop in Florence, or bottega as they were often called. It was more like a shop as well as an art studio.
Verrocchio conducted a rigorous teaching program that involved studying surface anatomy, mechanics, drawing techniques, and the effects of light and shade on materials such as draperies.
You can imagine Leonardo absorbing as much as he could, trying to satiate his hunger to learn. Much of his practice was rooted in experience rather than theory.
He learned to prepare canvases and paints and was introduced to the optics of perspective. The technical secrets of sculpture, bronze casting, and goldsmithing were part of the curriculum, and he was encouraged to study, through direct observation, the structure of plants and the anatomy of animals and humans.
Through studying from observation, like with his drapery studies, he understood the importance of values, the ability to deploy light and shade to emphasize an object's three-dimensional form. Or in his own words,
the first intention of the painter is to make a flat surface display a body as if modeled and separated from this plane, and he who surpasses others in this skill deserves most praise. This accomplishment, with which the science of painting is crowned, arises from light and shade, or we may say chiaroscuro.
Chiaroscuro is an Italian word for light and dark. It's essentially the difference and also the gradation between values that are created when a light hits an object. It's what gives an object form and depth, and the better you can implement this in your drawing or painting, the more realistic it will appear. When it comes to my own work, I'm trying to improve on this. If you've watched some of my recent videos, you'll know that I've been working through a book titled How to Render by Scott Robertson, which covers many techniques for accurately representing light, shadow and texture. All of these are essential in conveying three-dimensional forms. In addition to chiaroscuro, there's also another word, sfumato. No, I didn't say tomato. I said sfumato, and this is Italian for smoke, or going up in smoke. Isaacson says it's the dissipation and gradual vanishing of smoke into the air. It's a term that is used to describe the hazy edges around the subject being painted. And if you look at some of Leonardo's work, you'll notice that there's no contour lines that can often result in a drawing or painting looking more like a cartoon. In a series of maxims for young painters, Leonardo had wrote,
"Your shadows and lights should be blended without lines or borders, in the manner of smoke losing itself in the air."
Again, it's something that I also need to consider when it comes to my own work. What I've learned from reading how to render is that if you are able to implement the effect of light correctly, there should be no need for a contour line. Michael Gelb uses this word sfumato as the heading for another principle that is on the willingness to embrace ambiguity, paradox and uncertainty. Something that Leonardo was evidently able to tolerate, especially when exploring some of the subjects he had become obsessed with later in his life. In 1468, when Leonardo was around 1 year into his apprenticeship, Verrocchio's workshop was given the task of constructing and placing a 2-ton copper sphere on top of Brunelleschi's dome that we mentioned earlier in the video. To lift and fix the sphere into position, there were a lot of cranes and hoists that had to be used, many of which were previously designed by Brunelleschi, but also drawn in meticulous detail by Leonardo, who would have witnessed and potentially played a part in the project that was finally completed in 1471 when he was 19. Isaacson describes it as a triumph of both art and technology, and a project that would have ingrained in Leonardo a sense of interplay between artistry and engineering. It was something that he'd still refer to decades later in his notebook. At the age of 20, Leonardo's apprenticeship had come to an end, but he decided to stay and continue to work and live at Verrocchio's workshop.
I'm not leaving. I'm not leaving. I'm not fucking leaving!
He was now considered to be a master painter, and he contributed to a few paintings in collaboration with Verrocchio, such as Tobias and the Angel and the Baptism of Christ. In his biography, Isaacson explains how Leonardo had surpassed his teacher in many ways.
With the Baptism of Christ, Verrocchio went from being Leonardo's teacher to being his collaborator. He had helped Leonardo learn the sculptural elements of painting, especially modeling, and also the way a body twists in motion. But Leonardo, with thin layers of oil both translucent and transcendent, and his ability to observe and imagine, was now taking art to an entirely different level.
Giorgio Vasari, an earlier biographer of Leonardo da Vinci, said that Verrocchio resolved never to touch a brush after seeing his work. It's a bit like going on Instagram and seeing all of the great work by other artists that reminds you of your own inadequacies. Boxman's got a long way to go before he surpasses his master, being me. So in his 20s, Leonardo had produced a few more paintings as well, but this time on his own. One of these paintings depicts the Annunciation. This is another biblical subject that was quite popular, and like with a lot of these scenes, had been painted by other artists before. I wanted to mention this one because although it's one of the most well-known portrayals of this subject, it's also a painting that is quite flawed, to the extent that many experts even question whether it was only Leonardo who worked on this. For example, one mistake that I hope you guys might have noticed if you've been watching my perspective drawing videos is this wall in the background here. You can see how it's been drawn as if it's being viewed from higher up, and the end of the wall is tapering at an incorrect angle, inconsistent with the rest of the image. Another perspective error has been made with the cypress trees in the background. They're all drawn at the same size, yet the one closest to the house appears to be further forwards and so should be larger than the others. The way that Virgin Mary has been painted is also criticised due to her awkward positioning in relation to the book that her right arm is reaching, an arm which is said to appear too long and dislocated in some points.
Well, actually, although the arm seems unnatural when viewing the painting from a central position, some experts have supposed that this may have been intentional and that the painting was conceived to be viewed from another point of view. This is an example of anamorphosis, a kind of optical illusion that Leonardo was known to have studied through sketches in his notebooks.
I also read that, and there could be some truth in it, but whether these mistakes were actually mistakes or an attempt to experiment with anamorphosis, we shouldn't forget that Leonardo was only a young artist around this time, you know. Later in his life, he would improve his understanding of perspective and optics, and regardless of these errors, it's still a painting that's praised for many reasons, including his implementation of some of the techniques we just discussed, such as sfumato. Sfumato, I enjoy saying that.
The Annunciation shows Leonardo in his early 20s experimenting with light, perspective, and narratives involving human reactions. In the process, he made some mistakes, but even the mistakes, which came from innovating and experimenting, heralded his genius.
As we are talking about potential mistakes, now might be a good time to mention another Da Vincian principle that Michael Gelb calls dimostrazione. You have to say these with an Italian accent as well. But this is a commitment to test knowledge through experience, persistence, and a willingness to learn from mistakes. We'll come to see that Leonardo da Vinci makes a lot of mistakes and blunders throughout his life. You know, nobody is perfect, even if they are considered to be one of the greatest geniuses of all time. What matters most is how we deal with failures. You can't let them get the best of you. Instead, you have to accept them and learn from them. You know, when you look at what Leonardo had achieved throughout his life and all of these challenging tasks that he took on, mistakes were inevitable, but he would always learn from them and carry on. There's a note in one of his notebooks that's referenced by Michael Gelb where Leonardo writes,
Obstacles do not bend me. Every obstacle is destroyed through rigor.
For a man who emphasised learning from experience, this unshakable mentality was necessary. It's something that we could all do to be reminded of once in a while, especially Boxman. You know, every time the going gets tough, he crumbles and wants to give up, but I always tell him that that's just part of the process. If it was easy, then it wouldn't be worth doing. So a few more paintings Leonardo had done around that time included 2 paintings of the Madonna. And no, Boxgirl, I'm not talking about the singer. The Madonna is another biblical subject which features Mary with her baby Jesus. It was a very prevalent image in Christianity, and again, many artists created their own versions of this. However, it's clear to see which versions were done by Leonardo, as they are early examples of his use of chiaroscuro and sfumato, which results in very realistic depictions of Mary and Jesus. One of his first non-religious paintings is a portrait of a young woman called Ginevra di Benci, and again it's clear to see some of the distinctive characteristics that help you recognise a painting done by Leonardo da Vinci. He would apply very thin layers of oil on top of each other to create that hazy, almost translucent blend between areas of light and shadow. If you look at how he paints her hair, you know, it's depicted in a way that is similar to how he paints the hair of many figures throughout his other paintings. He's employing the use of light and shadow, along with this careful layering of oil to create these delicate, lifelike curls. It's one of the first known three-quarter view portraits in Italian art, as opposed to a side profile that was more common at that time. This means that she's eyeing the viewer directly, and it's her eyes that stand out as one of the most notable features here. They're very three-dimensional, which I think results in her looking quite tired. If you haven't guessed already, I'm not an art critic or an art historian, and I don't want to spend too much time discussing these paintings and his work in such detail because this is not that type of video. Instead, I'm more concerned with his approach to life in general, right? But obviously his work is the result of that.
Leonardo was a master at painting women. From Ginevra da Benci to the Mona Lisa, his portraits of women were deeply sympathetic and psychologically insightful.
However, Leonardo wasn't interested in women romantically. Like many artists back then, he was sexually attracted to men, and being gay wasn't uncommon in Florence. As I said, other artists who were gay included Donatello, Michelangelo, you know, most of the Ninja Turtles. It was accepted and seen as being completely normal, despite sodomy still being a crime. And in 1476, just before Leonardo turned 24, he was accused of engaging in sodomy with a male prostitute. And he wasn't the only one. There was a list which named 4 young men who engaged with his sexual services. Now, whilst these charges could have had some serious repercussions, one of the men who was named was from a well-known family that had ties to the Medicis, who essentially ruled Florence, right? They had a lot of economic power and political influence, and so the case was eventually dismissed. At this time, Leonardo was still working and living at Verrocchio's workshop, and I mean, he was 24 now, and at that age, most artists had already left to start up on their own. Leonardo did eventually leave to open up his own workshop in 1477, but it's said that commercially it was a failure.
During the subsequent 5 years before he headed off to Milan, he would receive only 3 known commissions, one of which he never started, and the other 2 he left unfinished. Nevertheless, even 2 unfinished paintings would be enough to enhance his reputation and influence the practice of art.
The first of these 2 sadly unfinished paintings was The Adoration of the Magi. Again, it was a religious painting, one of the most popular scenes in Renaissance Florence, in which the 3 wise men are giving the baby Jesus their gifts, being gold, frankincense and myrrh. Leonardo had made multiple preliminary drawings in preparation for this. On screen is a drawing that is often shown when discussing this painting. You can see how he's created a perspective grid in which his lines recede to a vanishing point. If you've watched some of my other videos, you'll know that I'm quite a fan when it comes to perspective grids, and whilst this one might not be perfect, you have to remember that the concept of perspective and the methods involved was something that was still being discovered and studied at that time. You know, it's not like artists could just jump on YouTube and learn everything they needed to online. I suppose we're quite fortunate these days to have that resource. Along with his meticulous grid, he had also sketched out some of the figures and horses that he was to include in the scene. And this was the final but not finished result. This painting is often praised for its composition and the emotions that are captured on the characters' faces.
As the viewer's eye moves around this frenzied vortex, the painting becomes not merely a moment, but a dramatic narrative.
Each of the figures painted here tells a story that is conveyed through their gesture and expression. Leonardo had written in one of his notebooks that
a good painter should decide broadly upon the position of the limbs and attend first to the movement appropriate to the mental attitudes of the creatures in the narrative.
It's fair to say that he was on track to creating another masterpiece, yet he stopped and never finished this painting. It was very ambitious to paint a scene like this, which involved so many figures, and you know, Leonardo was said to be a perfectionist, and perfecting this painting must have been a rather intimidating task. Many suspect that it became too overwhelming for him. An earlier biographer, Vasari, had said that
it seemed to him that the hand was not able to attain to the perfection of art in carrying out the things which he imagined.
If you're an artist or a creative person, like many of you who watch my videos, you've likely experienced that nagging feeling that your work could always be better. Even though what you've created is impressive and others might admire it, it's hard to ignore the flaws that you see in your own work. This is why artists are often called their own worst critic. You know, when you set such high standards for yourself, you're bound to find issues with what you've done. I've struggled with this in the past, you know, it's just prevented me from doing anything. Recently I've been producing more videos and creating more artwork as a result, and I've found that I'm a lot more productive and in turn happier when I'm not overthinking, when I just accept imperfection. And it seems that Leonardo struggled to do that. And whilst in his case, long term, it resulted in the creation of a handful of completed masterpieces, it's also something that short term would be the cause of a lot of anguish. The next and final painting we'll discuss in this video is one that Leonardo had started around the same time as the last, and it's called Saint Jerome in the Wilderness. Now, I mention each of these paintings because with each one there is always something that helps to describe the kind of person Leonardo was, the artist behind the art. And this religious scene shows Saint Jerome, a very scale and frail man, sitting in the desert with a lion at his feet. It's said that the lion became his companion after he pulled a fawn from his paw. So yeah, it's an odd painting, one that also went unfinished. However, it wasn't abandoned completely. Because what's fascinating about this painting is that Leonardo began working on it in 1480, and at that time he had yet to acquire a thorough understanding of anatomy to paint St. Jerome's neck, specifically a muscle called the sternocleidomastoid as accurately as depicted here. This is known due to a later drawing that he created in 1495 in preparation for The Last Supper, in which he had drawn this muscle incorrectly, showing it as a single muscle when in fact it is two. So how did he manage to get it right here with St. Jerome?
Oh, let me guess. Time travel?
What? Time travel? No. The theory is that the painting was done in two phases. The first being around 1480 and then the second being in 1510 when Leonardo had gained a better understanding of anatomy through his dissections and observational studies. So Leonardo kept hold of this painting, like he would with many of his paintings, and went back to amend it years later, 20 years later.
It shows that Leonardo's record of unreliability was not simply because he decided to give up on certain paintings. He wanted to perfect them, so he kept hold of many of them for years, making refinements.
So perhaps Leonardo never intended to leave these paintings unfinished. Like with St. Jerome, maybe he was planning to go back to them at a later date, once he had filled in the gaps of his knowledge and perfected many of the things he strived to improve on. Like I said, he was a perfectionist, and a lot of his paintings were never even given to the clients who commissioned them, like the Mona Lisa, for example. You know, it seems like, as I mentioned earlier, Leonardo struggled to draw that line to say that something was finished, or to even try and continue to finish something without understanding everything that was required. That's why the Mona Lisa and many of his paintings he did finish are considered to be some of the greatest works ever created, because he's thrown a life's worth of practice into them. We can look back over the life of Leonardo now and see all that he accomplished, but if you put yourself in his shoes at that stage in his life, you can imagine his frustration. He's approaching his 30s now. He's failed to complete these paintings whilst at the same time seeing the success of a lot of his rivals. You know, there was probably a lot of self-doubt. In fact, there's a section in his biography by Walter Isaacson around this time in his life titled Despair, in which Isaacson references some of the notes that Leonardo had written down in his notebook.
We do not lack devices for measuring these miserable days of ours, in which it should be our pleasure that they be not frittered away without leaving behind any memory of ourselves in the mind of man.
Leonardo was clearly dealing with a lot of inner turmoil. Isaacson says that he had established his genius but had remarkably little to show for it publicly.
While I thought I was learning how to live, I have been learning how to die.
At the age of 30, Leonardo da Vinci decided to move on. He left Florence and headed to Milan, where he would spend the next 17 years. This was a long video, but I did suspect that. Obviously, if people enjoy this type of content, I will create a second part and potentially a third part, so let me know if you do want to see more. I'm also trying to intertwine the 7 Da Vincian principles throughout this video, principles that Michael Gelb covers in his book titled How to Think Like Leonardo da Vinci. That's a great book, and if you do want to learn more about this man, I'd also recommend purchasing the biography by Walter Isaacson. That's what I've been referencing a lot in this video. Anyways, with all of that being said, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.
As a well-spent day brings happy sleep, so a life well spent brings happy death.